everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. Good morning to those of you joining us from here in Washington, D.C., and good afternoon to those of you joining us from across the Atlantic today. I'm Emily Slater. I'm the Executive Director of the Bretton Woods Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event on the WTO, being jointly organized by BWC and the Aspen Institute of Germany. We had initially planned to host this event in the aftermath of the 12th Ministerial of the WTO, which, as we all know by now, has unfortunately been postponed due to the emergence of the Omicron variant. But really, I think that today's topic of conversation is all the more timely because of it, as the WTO and member countries work towards issues such as coronavirus vaccines, dispute settlement, fisheries subsidies, among others. And we have a panel of leading experts today who are all friends as well. I think I'm the stranger in this bunch, who are going to share their views on policy priorities for the WTO going forward and how a transatlantic partnership could help drive and shape the reform agenda. So before I turn it over to them, I am going to quickly introduce our moderator, Dr. Stormy Annika Mildner, who is the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Germany. And she has had a distinguished career as both an academic and as a practitioner across the international trade ecosystem. She is also a member of our Bretton Woods Committee Advisory Council. So Stormy, thank you very much for your leadership at BWC and to you and your team at Aspen Institute Germany for co-organizing this event with us today. And I will turn it over to you to kick off our panel.
Thank you so very, very much, Evelyn, not just for the nice introduction, but also for initiating and co-organizing this event today. I don't know how you, our speakers and participants, felt when we got the announcement that MC12 was to be postponed. I felt first disappointed. Because I thought this is the time to have a breakthrough in the negotiations. Then a few seconds later, I felt understanding because it would have been such a difficult environment and also quite dangerous for the participants because of the new corona variant. Then a couple of seconds later, I felt worried because I thought, oh dear, will they be able to keep up the negotiation momentum? Then I felt hopeful because I thought, oh, they will, because they have people like Annabelle working for them and they are going to keep going just as Ignacio and many others would make sure for it. And then I have to say, I felt a little worried again because I know about the history of the WTO. So what we want to do today is get a better feeling where we currently stand after the postponement of MC12. And we also want to see where the WTO could, should, and can go. And we want to talk about the transatlantic relationship and what the transatlantic partners can do to ensure that the WTO moves forward and in the right direction. And I have a wonderful panel with me today, and I have to say old friends. And it is so lovely to see, at least virtually, to see all of you shortly before Christmas. It's like a Christmas present you're giving to me being here today. Let me briefly introduce our panelists, although I'm pretty sure, at least in the trade world and probably beyond, you all don't need a lengthy introduction. Ignacio Becerro, you are the Director in charge for multilateral affairs, strategy and economic analysis at DG Trade of the EU Commission. You have been with the Commission for quite a while in different positions working, and that's how I met you first on the Transatlantic Economic Partnership, TTIP, and but you have also been a professor and worked on the issues analytically. Annabelle Gonzalez, you, Annabelle, have joined the WTO not so long ago as new Deputy Director General, and that was in June this year. But you have been working on trade issues for also quite a while, being an expert on many different trade issues. And we have met the first time under the German G20 presidency, where trade was also very top of the agenda. Jeff, you have been a driver in the academic world on trade policies. And your studies are always top of the list for my students at the Hertie School to read. So it's always a pleasure having you here in real life, and not just reading your words, which are great too, but actually hearing what you have to say. You've been with the Peterson Institute for a while, driving the trade research agenda of the Institute. And I just heard earlier when we talked to each other that while you are still very, very active for the Institute, you're doing so from the home office right now, but you're commuting between your home office and the Peterson Institute because of the Corona pandemic. And last but not least, my good friend, Claudia Schmucker, who has been a pillar of the German Council on Foreign Relations on trade issues. You have been the head of the program for trade globalization, but for the last few years, you have been the head of the geoeconomics program at the Council on German Relations, DGAP. And you are an expert on all trade and investment relation issues like investment screening, very active in the T20 and the T7. And it's so very, very nice to have you here. How we are going to do this today is we are going to start with a short round of discussions with the panelists. And then we are also going to open it up for the questions from the audience. So get ready. So in about, I would say 30 minutes time, I would love to hear from the audience, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. And to ensure that it's going to be interactive, I will start by asking our panelists a short question with a short answer to get us warming up and get us started. And my first question to you is going to be, how do we keep, after postponing MC12, how do we keep the momentum going? And I would like to start with Ignacio.
Okay, Stormy, and it's a great thing to be here to participate in this panel. I think the critical issue is going to be how to keep the political attention focused on the critical issues that need to be solved by ministers on the 4 key questions which are in the agenda of NC12. The response to COVID-19, the conclusion of fisheries subsidies negotiations, defining a work program to advance on the reform of the agricultural sector, and defining the way to discuss in the WTO reform. These are the 4 critical issues that are there for ministers to decide. All 4 issues are of critical importance. On each of those 4 issues, we know very well at this point in time which are the key political stumbling blocks. And I think the question is going to be how it is going to be possible over the next months or so between now and the end of January to keep attention focused on identifying the way forward on the political stumbling blocks on each of the 4 items which I have mentioned.
Thank you very much for this very concise answer. Annabelle, how do we keep the momentum going?
Well, you know, I recently, well, first of all, let me thank you, Stormy, for this kind invitation to the Aspen Institute, to you and to Emily and the Bretton Woods Committee. I'm delighted to be here. So I wrote a blog just recently, which I titled Omicron Stop Trade Ministers from Meeting, but it need not stop WTO members from delivering. And I think that there are 3 things that we can do to keep the momentum. And I think in line with what Ignacio was saying, first, I think we need to harvest what can be harvested. And WTO members are already doing that. We know that last week, a group of 67 WTO members announced the successful conclusion of the negotiation on services domestic regulation. And that's very important news because that is an agreement that will cut red tape in services trade and that could potentially have a very positive impact in the global economy of around 150 billion US dollars. So first, again, harvest what can be harvested. Second, I think we must continue continue to narrow the gaps. In the weeks prior to the postponed ministerial, delegations in Geneva were engaged in intensive line-by-line negotiations on the fishery subsidies agreement. Well, there is no reason in my mind why those members could not continue to negotiate, to continue closing the gaps. The negotiations have been going for some time, and we really need to bring them to fruition. And something similar in the case of agriculture. And third, I think we must bring fresh and creative ideas to the table. And this is particularly important in areas where we had not seen a lot of movement in the run-up to MC12, including on the WTO response to the pandemic, and in particular, the intellectual property dimension of that discussion. This is also true, of course, of what I think is a very critical area for the WTO, which is WTO reform. Let me just conclude this segment by saying that I also think that we need to find creative formats to take decisions, even amid the pandemic-induced uncertainty regarding in-person meetings. We cannot, I think, wait for ministers to meet all at the same time in the same place to take decisions in all key areas, because there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. So thinking what can be done in alternative formats would also be important.
Great, thank you so much. And we will come back to this in the second round for sure. Jeff, your ideas for keeping the momentum going.
Well, thank you, Stormy, and thank you, Emily, for inviting me. Very distinguished panel, and I'm pleased to participate. But I have a more dour outlook on the situation than the previous two speakers. We need to restore momentum. We don't, it's not how to continue it. And my fear is that the WTO, if the ministerial meeting had taken place, it would have been not a very productive affair with limited outcomes. And much more is needed. And there are problems that we'll discuss throughout this hour on getting the needed results. I think it's more than stumbling blocks that Ignacio talked about. I think we have real political obstacles in terms of political will to move forward with a reform. But what is needed? I think we need to deliver progress on what our societies expect of a well-functioning multilateral trading system. Enforceable rules, and I emphasize enforceable because otherwise the rulemaking doesn't have much value. So we have to both fix the dispute settlement system and upgrade the rule book. But we need the rules, particularly on access to vaccines and medical supplies, to deal with the current pandemic that is on the forefront of all of our citizens' minds, and on support for carbon abatement measures. An issue that got relatively short shrift during the climate change summit in Glasgow a few weeks ago. That's, I think, a big agenda that is not getting the prominence in Geneva that it should.
Thank you so much. And this is why we wanted to have you on the panel to bring in a little bit of a critical view. Let's see if Claudia continues with that.
Yes, a bit. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, for having the discussion also with you, Stormy. As you said, it's important to keep momentum, and I think I would agree with Jeff. It's important to restore momentum, because if this cannot be kept up, it will be seen as another failure of the WTO. And I think it would have severe consequences for the credibility of the whole organization. So we would actually stick to your first feeling of disappointment. So I jumped to the next feeling of hopefulness that you mentioned, because I think, and this is what Annabelle mentioned, the services domestic regulation, the conclusion was so important. It's so symbolic. It's such a symbolic event that the WTO manages to agree on such an important initiative. And I think this pushed a bit aside the disappointment that we felt in the beginning when MC12 was postponed. I think we need the same push for the other joint statement initiatives. especially on e-commerce and investment facilitation, where a lot of developing countries are also participating, to get this positive feeling and momentum to keep that. As was mentioned before, we do need multilateral progress, and I think I heard here end of February would be desirable for fisheries. I think this is particularly important because what Jeff said, we need to deliver on what people expect. And the fisheries negotiations have the Sustainable Development Goals at its core, and all WTO members committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think this is one of the major things that we need to finish. And my last point that was mentioned before, we do need a broader pandemic-related package to ensure that we can show that the trading system is responsive to the challenges raised by the pandemic. And here, I think particularly with regard to export restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful first round, which sets us very, very well for the second one. And Annabelle, you mentioned as your third point, we need fresh and creative ideas, and we need creative formats to move forward. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more what you have in mind, what role the Secretariat also can play. And maybe you can also directly answer to Jeff and Claudia, with a little bit more pessimistic or maybe realistic view.
Thank you, Stormy. Well, I think, this is a question of, do you see it, do you see the glass half full or half empty? It's clearly, I think, a disappointment that MC12 could not have happened, but I do think it was the right decision. And I myself, and I think the whole Secretariat went through a similar process than the one that you described, Stormy. But one important thing is that delegations in Geneva sort of wasted no time in getting back to business and in looking as to how negotiations in the different areas can go forward. And that has been happening in the area of trade and health, including with, if you wish, a deeper engagement in the area of intellectual property more recently. That is also being discussed in the area of fisheries. And I think in agriculture, a bit more challenging. It was always going to be a modest outcome for MC12. But one very bright spot indeed has been, or maybe let me mention two bright spots. One is the trilateral initiatives. We discussed the service of domestic regulation, but likewise significant progress on investment facilitation for development and digital trade. Again, an area where there are some important differences, but also there has been good progress this year. So I think we should continue to leverage that bright spot. And another, I think, bright spot that came about in the context of this ministerial, which is actually the declarations will be launched this week, are in the area of trade and environment. And here we have, again, three, in Geneva, they use all these terms now. I think these are called structure dialogues that will begin or will continue in a way on topics like plastics, trade in plastics, on trade and sustainability, and on fossil fuel subsidies. So these are three important areas, which I think could deepen the WTO engagement in the area of trade and environment, and more importantly, could pave the way for greater WTO contribution to sustainability objectives. So I believe that in each of these areas, we see different ways in which delegations are coming together and see how is it that they can deliver. On the broader multilateral topics, you're right that the Director General and the Chair of the General Council have prompted delegations to try to reach, come closer to agreement by the end of February, certainly in fisheries, in the text that was there in agriculture, and most importantly in the area, I think, of trade and health, including on intellectual property. And we shall see. But it's the fact that the WTO ministerial was suspended. It was suspended for reasons that in a way were exogenous to the organization, and there is no reason. It is also true that there's always a bit of momentum that is built before a ministerial, and that there's a little bit of that energy that sort of evaporates once the ministerial doesn't happen. But here we know that it's a question of, well, can we hold it in a date that is not too far away, and how can we sort of bring up this energy level again? And I think by taking each topic on its merits and finding ways to work in each of the areas may be the way to go.
To unmute myself. Thank you so much, Annabelle. I would like to hand over to Ignacio. I know that the EU would have gone to Geneva with a very ambitious reform package. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the EU has in mind for the future of the WTO, where you are seeing sticky points and where you see actually momentum to move forward.
Well, yes, Stormy, but let me perhaps continue for the time being on MC12, because earlier this year we published a paper with our views about how to advance on WTO reform. It was based very much on our conviction that this should really be a priority for trade policy, and we include the specific ideas about how to reinforce the WTO in its monitoring and policy deliberating function, how to make the negotiating function more flexible, and how to reform the WTO dispute settlement. And all of these issues are critical, and we think that it is going to be essential that the WTO sets out a clear path forward on WTO reform. But I would like to go back again to what Annabelle was saying about the critical issues that are in front of us over the next 2 months. Now, on each of those issues of the multilateral nature, I think that we can identify 2 or 3 critical political questions which are difficult and which need to be resolved. Now, when it comes to the issue of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have a text which has been prepared by the Ambassador of New Zealand, David Walker, that looks into commitments on export restrictions, transparency, trade facilitation, and an action plan in terms of how to enhance resilience for future pandemics. I will be very clear, the European Union would have wished this text to be more ambitious than it is, but it is a good basis to see how to respond to those different components of the COVID-19 crisis. Obviously, the most difficult issue is the issue of intellectual property. We have been on our side very actively engaged with the proponents of the waiver to try to see where we can identify a way forward. And I would not hide that that is certainly the most difficult issue of those relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you would then go into the question of fisheries subsidies, it's very clear that it's critical for the credibility of the WTO to show at this point in time that we can conclude a meaningful agreement which is based on sustainability. There has been a huge amount of progress in the discussion that took place in the lead up to MC12. We have now a text which has a very limited number of brackets to be solved, of which, quite frankly, the most difficult one, the one which is going to require some bigger political decisions, has to do with certain aspects of a special and differential treatment. I think that's the most difficult issue that needs to be solved. But again, if there's political will, if there is focused attention, no reason why we should not be able to come to a conclusion. And it would be a great signal of confidence in the WTO if we could conclude an agreement on fisheries subsidies. Now, when it comes to the issue of agriculture, I mean, agriculture is critical for many WTO members. In a way, the big issue which has been left from the DDA agenda, which needs to be resolved for the credibility of the organization. I think everyone would agree that there are 2 fundamental issues on which there is a need to advance in agriculture, which is how to further reform trade distorting domestic support and how to find a permanent solution on the issue of public stockholding. We are not going to be solving these issues in NC12, but we need to define a path forward, a work program on how to advance on those 2 issues. And again, it should not really be so difficult to find the political will to identify a balance between domestic support reduction and the issue of public stockholding. And finally, when it comes to the issue of WTO reform, I think everyone would agree that there's a need to discuss in the WTO the reform of the 3 core functions of the organization. The issue is really going to be what is the right institutional way to do it, how detailed should be this work program of WTO reform. But again, it should not really be rocket science to be able to find the political will to advance on those issues. This being said, it is true, there is a risk of a loss of political momentum, and it's really going to require a lot of clever engagement by the WTO Director General, by the members between now and the end of January to identify a potential landing zone on those 4 key areas. Now, of course, there's also the multilateral activities on which a lot of positive momentum is there, and I'm very glad that Anna referred to the important initiative that will be announced, I think, tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, we will show Jeff that yes, a significant number of WTO members, not all, but a significant number of WTO members consider there's a need to further consider issues relating to climate in the context of the WTO.
It's great that we get a preview of this important initiative. Maybe we can later also hear who is not in favor of moving forward on these issues. But let me now hand over to Jeff. We all know that the EU and the US alone are not sufficient anymore to ensure compromise and moving forward. But without the US and without the EU, certainly that is also not the case. Jeff, tell us a little bit about the stance of the US and the administration and where that is going.
Well, first of all, let me say that I am not a member of the administration, so my views are personal. So this is an objective analysis of the US policy, and not uncritical, but certainly the current US policy toward the WTO is a vast improvement over the malign neglect of the previous administration. And so there is an interest in constructive engagement and progress in WTO reform. That said, US policy is constrained by what I would call a conflict of interests, plural. A conflict of interests among the different constituencies that support the White House and that are needed for support of various domestic and international issues before the US Congress. And because the US Congress is so evenly divided, the administration is quite constrained in pursuing initiatives, including some involving climate change, that would jeopardize the support of some Democrats who are needed for big domestic legislation and for international support. And that, of course, will complicate the effort that Annabelle and others have in moving forward with substantial reform on fossil fuel subsidies. But the fact that you have U.S. engagement, the fact that the U.S. is going to be sending soon a confirmed ambassador to Geneva to work on negotiations is helpful. But the U.S. priorities, I think, will focus more on narrowly focused topics like forced labor and the addition of provisions with regard to that in this fisheries subsidies pact, which will cause some consternation or difficulties. But on the fish subsidies, I've been involved in these talks for a long time, and I think they're very important. But I do not underestimate the difficulties with trying to get consensus or compromise on the special and differential treatment provisions, because those provisions essentially gut the major disciplines that are needed in constraining deep water overfishing. But that's one important area and one important constraint. I think the U.S. interest in WTO reform is in other ways a bit too broad, and it seeks systemic changes regarding non-market economies. I think it's important to upgrade the WTO rulebook in the area of subsidies. And indeed, I was involved in writing international trading rules on subsidies more than 40 years ago. They need reform, obviously. But I think if you try to do it in a way that attacks entire systems, you're going to end up being unable to find the support among many of the major trading nations. And so that, I think, requires a movement to look at dealing with support for state-owned enterprises, not as a systemic issue, but as a sectoral issue. And perhaps starting with steel and aircraft, where there are real problems that both the United States and Europe need to address. Finally, the point that, on dispute settlement needs repeating. We have to have effective reforms on dispute settlement to allow the new rules to move forward and allow the political compromises to be made. Very hard for officials to accept new rules if they can't confirm and guarantee that those rules will be effectively enforced. And so that's an area that I think deserves much more attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm handing over to Claudia, and if I read your, or if I read your face expressions correctly, you have something to say about the US engagement as well.
Yes, I was supposed to say something on transatlantic cooperation at the WTO. So I start with a few general remarks that basically mirror what Stormy said in the beginning, which is we need the cooperation between the United States and the European Union. Otherwise, no reform is possible at the WTO. But first, this means it's not supposed to be an exclusive partnership. We have other areas where other partners are part of this. And this does not mean that the transatlantic partnership is enough, because we need the cooperation of China and other global players to really reach an agreement. But I think, and this is something that Ignacio just mentioned in the beginning, we need a lot more engagement by the United States. I do believe that the trade policy hasn't changed that much from the Trump administration. I believe they are much nicer. I believe that the European Union is no longer a foe, which could be a huge success. But I believe if you look on substance, you don't hear much of concrete proposals on how to advance WTO reform. And if I look at, for example, if I look at dispute settlement, so the European Union first has established an interim appeals mechanism. The United States is not part, and the EU has made two very concrete proposals on how to address US grievances. I think started in September 2018, and now again with the new trade policy. What we would need right now is a concrete answer of the United States of what would constitute an important reform of the binding dispute settlement system. But what we hear so far, and this might be because it's difficult internally, is we are very open. We are looking for answers from everyone, but we ourselves will not propose something very concrete. And I think if the United States would be willing to offer concrete proposals, the EU could enter in these kind of discussions, and other countries certainly need to be part of the discussion. And then we could easily have a new and reformed dispute settlement system, which, by the way, is also important for the United States, because it is a prerequisite to take joint action against unfair trade barriers by China at the WTO level. I'm a bit more positive of the transatlantic relationship in the negotiation function when I look at the other pillar of the WTO, because I think the United States and Europe share that the way forward for the WTO is multilateral and plurilateral. So I think at the last MC11, I think it was in 2017, both welcomed this other area of how to move WTO rules forward and how to modernize the organization. So the EU is part of all 4 joint statement initiatives. The United States, if I have that correctly, is only part of e-commerce and services domestic regulation, but still that both put political emphasis on these plurilateral negotiation as a way forward. I think this is very important. Both also work in the trilateral initiative on WTO reform. This was renewed just in November 2021. I think that's also a very important step to look at subsidies and to look at the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. One of the concerns that the EU shares with the United States and also with Japan. And I think both also had, also in the context of the trilateral initiative, several ways forward on how to deal with the problem of notification or a lack of notification. So I think the transatlantic partners, what you mentioned in the beginning, Stormy, they are not enough for WTO reform, but without it, no reform is possible. And I would hope that the Biden administration, which has a much more plurilateral outlook and much more emphasis also on global organization, would put forward a much more detailed reform agenda, so which could be a basis for a good discussion.
Thank you so much. I know that Jeff and Ignacio and Annabelle would love to jump in right away, but I also promised to bring in the audience. And please, our participants, start writing your Q&As now or raise your hand if you want to say something. So the first question is, I think it goes a little bit to Annabelle, by Miguel Schloss, who is asking about fundamental structural issues standing in the way for global integration. And I think what stands behind this is the question of how to get all countries more integrated into the world economy, especially when we take into account that several countries experienced a great setback because of the pandemic. We just had the opportunity to talk to Ms. Greenspan from the UNCTAD, telling us that some countries are set back by 2 decades. And I think the question is, how do we get those countries back into international trade and to the international trade agenda? And then we come back to the transatlantic issues. But first to Annabelle.
So I think this is a very important question because there are several factors that, of course, impact global trade cooperation, from geopolitical competition, technological disruption, the pandemic for sure. Now we have all the shipping and supply chain disruptions as well. But one would think that in light of all these circumstances, trade would have been moving in an opposite direction to where it is actually moving, which is trade has increased significantly this year as compared to even 2019 levels. Actually, trade between the EU and China, for example, has increased way significantly this year, and trade with the US is going in the same direction. So trade in itself has shown to be a very powerful instrument and has actually rebounded quite significantly this year, of course, from a low level last year, but even so. And it has been instrumental, for instance, in helping people across the world to have access to things like personal protective equipment. Even as trade, for example, decreased last year, trade in medical products increased by 16%, and in some cases, like personal protective equipment, even by over 400%. So the reality is that trade is very much alive, is contributing to the global economy. But of course, a stronger multilateral trading system is needed to underpin trade as as we have new developments happening. But also, it's important that it can bring the additional certainty that business required to do the investments that are going to be needed, in the digital economy, to bring green the economies. So this business certainty will be very, very relevant, I think.
Thank you so much. Ignacio, we had lost you for a second, but now we have seen a 180-degree view of you and your room. Nice to have you back. So over to you.
I was expelled from the meeting, but I think I'm back.
You are back.
Okay.
So maybe we can pick up on the issue of transatlantic, the transatlantic relationship being very important, but not sufficient. Does the EU have other coalition partners? And on the other side, do you have any countries you are currently struggling with to find a joint agenda?
Well, I mean, WTO reform is certainly a very complex endeavor, and it requires a strong effort to outreach to different groups of countries. Now, obviously, cooperation with the United States is important. I think I will be very frank. I think that cooperation between the EU and the US on WTO reform has significant scope for improvement. I mean, I fully understand that there have been many priorities for the new Biden administration, and we have made big progress in terms of solving bilateral problems between the United States and the European Union. We have made progress in setting a good framework for bilateral cooperation. But I will be very frank, I think there's a lot to do in terms of enhancing a strategic dialogue and cooperation between the United States and the European Union. And if we are going to advance on a meaningful WTO reform, going beyond the question about what to achieve on NC12, I think this is going to require much closer engagement between the United States and the European Union. As I said earlier this year, we put forward a paper setting out our views about WTO reform. These views are based on a strategic assessment that for us, an effectively functioning WTO is critical, and that in times of geopolitical conflict as the one that we are actually experiencing, it is even more important to have a WTO that works well. That if the European Union and the United States do not invest politically in the WTO, the influence of China in the WTO is going to increase, and that we need to actually work on the basis that, yes, there's a need to further develop the rule book, but that the basic framework of rules in the WTO, as they currently are, they continue to be essential for a well-functioning globalization and need to be backed up by a system of dispute settlement that works. That is our strategic assessment, and I think what will be important will be to have more dialogue between us and the United States to see to what extent this is a strategic assessment which is shared. And of course, it has implications down the line, and Claudia was very good about talking about the different aspects. I think, broadly speaking, probably yes, when it comes to the negotiating function. Not so clear when it comes to the monitoring and deliberating function. I think Ambassador Tait made some very good statements about the importance of the role of the WTO as a forum for policy deliberation. But our view is that if you actually want to have a WTO which is effective in terms of monitoring of trade policies, you need to assert a greater capacity of initiative of the WTO Secretariat. And we are not totally sure, but that's a view which is shared by the United States. And of course, when it comes to WTO dispute settlement, quite frankly, we would love to know what it is the view of the United States. We have been, of course, making very clear that we fully understand that reform of dispute settlement has to be meaningful. But at the end of the day, we need to have a system that works, that is effective, that is legitimate. And for us, that implies a reform appellate body, but it implies maintaining a two-tiered dispute settlement system. And on all of those issues, I think we are very much looking forward to see when the United States will be in a position to come forward and put forward concrete ideas about in which direction they want to see the WTO reform. Of course, the situation in the WTO is much more complex than just the United States and the European Union. There's a group of countries with which we are normally very like-minded when it comes to reform, particularly, for instance, the members of the Ottawa Group. There's the whole question about Africa and how to see that Africa sees a greater synergy between their own economic integration agenda and the WTO reform agenda. I think that's going to be one of the important challenges for WTO reform. China, from my point of view, is actually a very active player in the system, very clever in terms of how they play in the system, but there's always going to be a tendency by then to want to maintain the status quo. And in order to move beyond the status quo, there would need to be a little bit more of a push than the one that actually is there now. I totally agree with Jeff about the importance of reforming rules on subsidies. And I have to say that I would like to understand a little bit better what is the US agenda on that issue. We have just very recently relaunched the trilateral, and that would give us a better opportunity to understand in which direction the US also wants to move when it comes to the reform of rules on industrial subsidies. And then, quite frankly, there's also some players in the system where at this point in time, it's very difficult to understand exactly what it is that they want from the WTO. I will not mention any names, but at least there's a very important player in the WTO where I still wonder what it is that they actually want to get from the WTO. So I will just leave it at that for the time being.
I think, Jeff, this is your cue again to come in.
Well, I can follow directly from Ignacio because he said in more detail what I was trying to say earlier, and I think he said it very well. And the country involved that he did unnamed is India, and it has been a thorn in the side of WTO and GATT negotiators for a long time, in part because they represent developing country interests, which are important and have not been well addressed, and in part because they are, as Ignacio said, seeking the maintenance of the status quo in effect, because their demands for WTO changes are not feasible, nor in many cases desirable. So what that's leading to is a great difficulty in Geneva in getting the type of comprehensive agreements going forward, and leading countries, including and notably China, to develop the plurilateral and regional platforms that countries are going to increasingly move to if the WTO cannot address the new challenges to international trade and investment in the 21st century. This is the challenge that WTO members have. And I think a key component, and one that the United States and the European Union have not given enough attention to, and Annabelle has done a lot of work in this area, is how you create the incentives for more investment in developing countries. That's what special and differential treatment was always meant to do. How do you provide the means for developing countries to move up the development ladder and not hide behind protective tariff and quota walls? And yet the policies of developing countries in seeking to maintain the status quo are doing the exact opposite. So we need better rules, but not necessarily going back and changing what has happened in the past. The trade facilitation agreement is an important precedent. That agreement didn't have new rules on special and differential treatment. It had the ability of developing countries to accept a level of obligation, differing given their different means. And China accepted more obligations than most developing countries. I think that's what China will do going forward, and that should help inform US and European policies on how to address these issues in the fish subsidies agreement and elsewhere in talks in the WTO.
Annabelle, the WTO is a member-driven organization. We hear that a lot. And nonetheless, the Secretariat plays a very, very important role. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the role of the Secretariat and what you are currently doing also personally to ensure that on the different issues which you outlined, there is actually going to be progress.
So this is a very, again, a very important question, Stormy. I think let me focus on one role in which I am involved right now, and which I think also somehow shows the role that, and the increased role that the Secretary can have in the future, which is there are a lot of the discussions happening now in the WTO that are not compartmentalized. Take, for example, the discussion on trade and health. It has components of trade facilitation. It has components of regulatory cooperation. It has components of market access when you think about export restrictions. It has components, for sure, of intellectual property. And so there is a need for that discussion to come together under a common umbrella and to push for progress encompassing all these different elements. And that is one role, for instance, in which I am involved right now. And I think also showcases the work that the Secretariat can do in areas like this one. Let me give you another example. We have been engaged for some time now with our colleagues in the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD in putting together a study on subsidies. Which is one of the key points that we have been discussing today. Well, in working together with these organizations, we sort of leverage the resources that each one of us has to the service of our members, and hopefully try to bring information, data analysis that can be useful for members to sort of deepen their conversations in this area. So this, in my view, are two examples of the kind of work that the Secretariat is now doing, and which goes beyond, in a way, the work that was being done before. From there, you can have a conversation as to whether should the Secretariat have initiative to present proposals or not. And I think, there are different views in that regard. But, for me, what's for sure is that there is a very active role in terms of data compilation, analysis, fostering dialogue that can help members take better informed decisions.
Thank you so much. We are already getting to the end, unfortunately, and I can't believe we do have one more question from Miguel, but I'm looking at our participants again. You really don't have any questions anymore, because this is now the time to bring in any, or raise your hand. And I know that you are all Zoom literate, you know where the hand is, the electronic hand. And if not, we still have a few more minutes here with our panel. So let me turn to you, Claudia, two questions. First of all, I know that you do have an event coming up later this week with some Indian colleagues. And what is it you are going to bring to that conversation? What are you going to say in that exchange?
I will bring conflict to that discussion. It is my firm view that in order to reform the WTO, you need multilateral components and plurilateral components. And I think just by saying that, I will bring conflict, because I do believe that you need to have an open discussion on how to bring these inclusive or open plurilateral negotiations into the WTO framework. And I think this needs to be done. And this is another controversy. I think you need to have these rules with countries that are interested on e-commerce, on investment facilitation. I think India should be part of these plurilateral negotiations. I think India should reconsider their point. It would make sense. It would make economic sense. And I think they should be open to see how this could be done into the WTO framework, because otherwise I believe all these initiatives will be negotiated anyways, but outside the WTO framework, and this would be a disadvantage, especially for smaller countries, but also for India.
We are definitely going to continue with this conversation and with our next panel round, where we have then Indian and Chinese and South African representatives as well. There's one last question to you also, Annabelle, about the role of the private sector of business and civil society in the WTO. Can they contribute to the discussion?
Oh, Stormy, I have no doubt in saying yes. I think it is absolutely critical for business and for other stakeholders to participate in the discussions in the WTO by providing their views, providing their input, providing their analysis. And, in the run-up to MC12, I had engaged with a number of business groups and other stakeholders. And one interesting thing that I've seen is greater activity on the part of the stakeholders in bringing their own proposals to the WTO. A lot of them in particular have an opinion on what should WTO reform look like. And I think this is very positive. It brings energy to the work that we do. And it ultimately confirms that the work in the WTO has real world impact. And this, I think, is very important.
Thank you so much. And this brings us to our last round of a quick question and quick answers. It's almost Christmas time. So it's the time of writing wish lists. And you probably, I mean, you all remember when you were little kids, you were all excited and you had your wish list and you drew little pictures, what you wanted to see under the Christmas tree. So if you were to choose only one single present to open under the Christmas tree this year by the WTO or its members, what would it be, Claudia?
I had a long wish list. So it's very hard for me to think of one. If I think I would skip everything that I wanted to say, like, oh, fisheries, that was an old negotiation that we concluded successfully years ago. I would say a common sense of purpose, what the WTO should do. And if we have any problems in trade, naturally, the WTO is there for you to give answers to all the challenges that we have in the trade area.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Jeff, your wish.
Well, I've been focusing on all of the difficulties, and so you can't just wish away all of this. There has to be real political will, as the others have said. So, if you want my wish is that we can all travel safely to Geneva to begin to talk and negotiate again together, and without this burden on our societies. And that would be, I think, within the real spirit of the holidays.
Oh, thank you so much. Ignacio.
I think I would just wish the right doses of pragmatism and political will to inspire the countries in January to get what needs to be done to get MC12 to deliver an outcome that is meaningful.
Thank you so much. And Annabelle.
So I would say I agree with everything that has been said, and to say something different, I would add focused engagement and leadership to begin a serious discussion on WTO reform.
Thank you so very, very much. I know that as a moderator, you should step back and not wish at any wishes of your own. I still want to do it, just in case any of our German government representatives and new parliament members are listening in. Then my wish is that we are not just going to be internally focused on many important issues like social and climate and so on, but that we have lots of new parliamentarians in the Bundestag who are going to be interested in the WTO. That would be my wish. And now I am handing over to Emily. Thank you so very, very much for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much, Stormy, and thank you to all of our panelists. We were having a little technical issues on our side, so apologies for that if there was any interruption, but want to thank you all very much for joining us today. I think you've given us some reason for optimism, but also a healthy dose of reality. So we appreciate you being here, and we're at time, so that'll conclude our session for today. Thank you all once again.
Thank you so much and happy holidays.
Happy Christmas. Bye.
Holidays to all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.